Life, identity, and meaning are all understood as consisting of nothing more than language games, exercises, and role-playing. Social reality is experienced through the performance of life, the performance of the everyday. The only difference between the entertainment form known as the role-playing game and the role-playing game of real life is that, for some reason, a great deal of seriousness and levity is handed to each person in tandem with the role they choose or are given. Mackay, 2001. From the moment we are born, at least one role is decided for us, sex, and in turn, usually gender. From the moment we can comprehend what it means for our parents to go to work, we are asked, what role would we like to have? What do you want to be when you grow up? Before the human brain is even fully developed, we are told we need to choose what path we would like to go down for the rest of our lives. College, trade school, marriage. When people think of their roles and identity, most can boil them down to a few descriptors. A student, a manager, someone who's kind, patient, or maybe confident. In reality, roles are a complex and intertwining aspect of our lives that aren't as simple as we might initially assume. For example, are the roles we have consistent? Are you the same person you were 5 years ago, and 5 years from now will you be someone different? Do we decide who we are, or are we a product of our environment? Do our actions define our roles, or do our roles define our actions? Identity and role development are major areas of study in the academic world of psychology, and since the dawn and popularization of role-playing games in the 70s with tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, all the way to modern-day video game role-playing games like Final Fantasy or the Elder Scrolls series, there's been a unique overlap that has been noted and researched. You see, RPGs offer a unique experience, one that can only really be experienced in this specific genre. RPGs ask the question, what happens if you are placed into an environment where your real-life roles no longer define who you are? What happens if instead of being told who you are or who you should be, you are instead asked the question,
who are you?
When you start a role-playing game that has a character creator, what kind of character do you usually make? Personally, I tend to be the self-insert type of role player. I make a character that is a representation of how I would want to be if I lived in that world. Usually something vaguely humanoid whose class or skill set is as close as I can get to swordsman or spell sword, my two favorite archetypes. As I play through games and am presented with moral choices, I pick the choices that feel right to me as an individual.
Will he do it? Will he kill Whisper? Or will he throw his victory away?
Essentially, my goal is to immerse myself as much as I can into the world and push myself to think about how I would handle new situations. Some people experience role-playing games very differently though. When they create characters, they are creating someone who exists outside of themselves, like they are playing an entirely different person with a separate background, upbringing, and skill set. They don't make choices as they would, they make them as their character would. This allows for a style of play that doesn't restrict someone to their own moral compass. After all, it's not what I would do, it's what my character would do.
Yes, you step into the city, and along the street you see a homeless man.
I'm going to kill that homeless man with a natural 20.
Oh, wow.
Then there are the type of players who don't do either, choosing instead to ignore the implications of role-playing altogether, seeing their character more so as a vehicle to get them to the gameplay. I don't care who I am in this world, I just want to stab the dragon with my pointy sword. There are also games where we play a role without creating our own character, where we play a pre-established role, such as Geralt or Link. The types of characters we make and the roles we choose to inhabit can tell us a lot about ourselves. They can show us what we value, what we might be good at, what we might be bad at, who we are, or even who we want to be. RPGs are unique in that they can offer us a place to try on different identities free from the social expectations we would have in reality. To understand why, though, we need to look at how we form those identities in the first place. One of the major theories of identity and role development is called the looking-glass self by C.H. Cooley. This theory proposes that our personality, identity, and roles are determined in large part due to our social interactions. Essentially, who we are is a reflection of the specific individual or group of people that we are interacting with. Think about it like this. Do you act the same way around your parents as you do your best friend? With parents, assuming a relatively healthy relationship, most people are likely to be on their best behavior. Minimal cursing, no talking back. There is a likelihood that you have a few secrets that you keep from them, skeletons in your closet. Your best friend, on the other hand, likely knows a good amount of those secrets, and you are far less likely to feel like you need to limit or constrain yourself when speaking to your friend compared to your parents. What about when you are at work or speaking to your boss? Maybe you put on a customer service face, act a little nicer, show more respect. These different selves that we have are the core premise of the looking-glass self theory, that while we do have a core identity or self, we play different roles in relation to the social situations we are in. This works in 3 steps. First, people imagine how they appear to other people. Second, people imagine how others are judging them based on how they think they are being perceived. And third, people make adjustments to their actions and behaviors to represent who they would like to be seen as. There are some important caveats to this theory, though, that need to be understood. First is that we can't truly know how we appear to others. The rogue in your MMO group who doesn't have a DPS meter might think he's impressive to you, but you actually see him at the bottom of the charts and are just humoring him not to be rude. We can only assume from our own subjective standpoints how we think others are seeing us. As we learn more about someone, these assumptions can become more likely to be accurate, but we can never be sure unless we are told directly. Second is that individuals for the most part have the ability to selectively choose when they want to engage in the looking-glass self. If you are walking around a crowded city, you aren't likely to care about what every passing stranger thinks of you, and therefore aren't going to waste mental energy trying to adjust yourself in relation to their perceptions. When you're on a date, though, you are probably going to want to impress your partner, and therefore your looking-glass self might be a dressed-up or heightened version of who you usually are. The ability to choose can be impacted by social or practical pressure, though. Maybe you don't want to be seen as a yes man to your boss, but not doing so could put your livelihood on the line. This means that sometimes we can feel forced into portraying a version of ourselves that we don't believe reflects who we really are.
Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase.
Speaking of who we really are, it is important to remember that we have a looking-glass version of ourselves, how we see ourselves, and this is not always an accurate representation. When we look at our own personalities, we do not have an objective view of who we really are. Our looking-glass self can even be divided into different versions, such as how I see myself now and how I see my ideal self, and the actions we take in response to others can reflect either of these. The main point here, though, is that whether it's voluntary or reactionary, it can be difficult to present an authentic version of ourselves when we are concerned with the perceptions and judgments of others. That's where RPGs come back into play. In RPGs, quite a few things happen psychologically that allow for identity experimentation and even development. When you are playing a role-playing game, your looking-glass self functions differently because you are taking on a role that is outside of yourself. Even if you are like me and play characters that reflect your characteristics, you are free from the shackles of expectations that real social interactions would place on you. This leads to an environment where you can test or play around with your identity. This isn't something unique to only traditional role-playing games either. When we think of RPGs, we usually think of action-adventure games, Skyrim, Legend of Zelda, Divinity Original Sin 2, but there is another type of role-playing game that belongs in this conversation, and that is the social role-playing game. I'm going to reference and link to another video here called Identity, Gender, and VR Chat. Why is everyone in VR Chat an anime girl? In which the speaker discusses the interesting fact that a large majority of players in VR Chat are completely comfortable and willing to play as avatars that are a separate gender from themselves. I won't go into too much detail because that video covers the whole topic and you should check it out if you get a chance. The main premise, though, is that there is a sense of diffusion of role responsibility when one inhabits a virtual space that allows them to be someone else, or at least someone different from who they currently are. Your family members or boss aren't going to impact how you act in these environments because they aren't there for you to feel the need to adjust yourself to. When you are in a real-life classroom, you have to manage your looking-glass self in reference to your peers, your teacher, maybe the person you have a crush on, and others as well, all at once. Slipping up or acting out of character could have real social consequences, such as people not wanting to be around you anymore, or ruining your chances with the person you like. In the virtual space of RPGs, none of this happens. If you don't like a player you meet in VR Chat or an MMORPG, you can just block them or teleport somewhere else. You never have to see that person again. Let's take a look at a different identity development theory, and that's going to be James Marcia's identity statuses. This theory proposes that there are 4 stages of identity development that run on 2 axes, one of exploration and one of commitment. Exploration refers to how willing someone is to try out new identities or roles, or how much they have done so in the past, while commitment refers to how decided an individual is on their current role in life. A person can be high or low in either of these traits, which leads to the 4 unique identity statuses. First is identity diffusion, when you have no idea what you want your identity to be and aren't concerned with figuring it out. Moratorium, where you are open and explorative but don't have any strong opinions yet. Foreclosure, for when a choice has been made without thinking or was even made for you. And lastly, achievement, when you have explored and settled in an identity that feels true to you. The reason that RPGs are important when we're talking about the 4 stages of identity development is that RPGs provide a place where individuals, despite the commitment level of their real-life identities, can explore various identities with low commitment, essentially allowing for a person to safely wander in identity moratorium. One day you can be an elf wizard who is charming and noble, the next a talking cat just looking for a little extra coin.
Cajitas wares, if you have coin.
Identity can be seen more as an experiment as opposed to a decision. This diffusion of choice severity alongside the earlier mentioned role responsibility allows you to experiment in a safe place with different versions of yourself. You might be too nervous in real life to raise your voice or stand up for yourself, but Ugra the Destroyer isn't letting anyone talk down to him. By role-playing his various roles, people can develop skills that aren't ones they would usually engage in. What is even more interesting is that some of these skills we practice while role-playing are relatively transferable to life outside of the games. This may sound strange to you, but when I was an undergrad, one of my final projects involved role-playing as a therapist to an advanced AI from a company called Immersion. We got on a video call and a 3D animated character came on screen. This character could hold a conversation with me, it could simulate distress, and it even understood some of the nuances of our conversation. As a student role-playing, our goal was to conduct an intake session, where as a mental health practitioner you get to know your client, their needs, and develop a short-term schedule of what working with them in the future might look like. This session was recorded and then sent to our professor so they could grade our performance. I'm not a therapist though, and that session was just practice, roleplay. It was designed to help us develop the skills that a therapist would need by putting us in the shoes of one in an environment where there was no risk or potential for real-life consequences, just as a role-playing game gives. Tabletop role-playing games, in particular D&D, can also be used as a therapeutic method that allows people to build personal and social skills, again, in an environment with low risk. When you sit down at a tabletop role-playing game table, every character has a relatively clearly defined role, and the experience is moderated by a dungeon master. If that dungeon master is trained in psychotherapy-related skill sets, they can help guide players by creating scenarios that allow them to practice what they may be aiming to grow at. Don't just take it from me though. I reached out to Dr. Woodall, a licensed clinical psychologist who conducts role-playing game therapy, and she very generously allowed me to interview her for this video.
When it comes to like the specifics, how does it differ from say like a normal D&D game? You setting up like special scenarios or?
Sometimes I will set up special scenarios that I think will pull for certain things, or we'll, as a group, discuss maybe we want to deal with a certain type of situation, and I'll put it in. I think it also encourages people to be more open with each other.
Right.
Honestly, like because we are purposefully defining that this is a safe space to talk about those things, as opposed to like groups for fun. There might be things going on in the dynamics or something happening that's like, yeah, but I don't really want to like bring that up, talk about it. I feel like it's going to disrupt the group or somebody's going to get mad about it. You know, it's like, no, we like specifically can work with that because we're agreeing to.
I can't include the whole interview in the middle of this video, but I will include the whole interview as an unlisted video linked in the description box below if you would like to see our conversation. So let's take a look at an example of how role-playing games can be used in therapy. Let's say you have John, and John struggles with social anxiety. The Dungeon Master could introduce John's character to an NPC who will talk to him about his interests or adventures throughout the land so far. This mock conversation still requires the social skills of listening actively, speaking at the appropriate times, and not stumbling over one's own words. This is known as social skills building. The uses go just beyond social skill building though. Maybe you have someone who doesn't identify with their assigned birth gender, but is nervous about acting in a way that feels more comfortable to them due to what their peers or loved ones might think. In a role-playing game, you can roleplay as a different gender and get into the mindset of what it might be like to take on that role in real life by playing out various scenarios.
One of the reasons I feel like this is so useful and important, regardless of whether it's a therapeutic setting or not, it's just, you know, a game with friends, is that it does create, just by the nature of the game and how it works, it does create a space to have maybe portions of identity that don't feel safe to let out in the real world to be there. You know, for people who feel like they need to go out into their regular life and sort of cover who they are, right, or cover portions of who they are, then there's more freedom to allow that part of yourself to exist when you're playing, and then explore that, and then that becomes more integrated into yourself.
What really separates role-playing game therapy from just playing an RPG is the reflection period, where after a session the players and Dungeon Master reflect on their choices and what those choices mean in relation to who they are or who they want to be.
Like people are coming to it with the intention of not only wanting to learn these things about themselves, but wanting to talk about it. So we do game time, but we also spend like 20 to 30 minutes talking about what people notice about themselves specifically. And so I think it takes it to this other level of the opportunity to hear from other people about how you are and what you observe about yourself, and try on new identities and talk about what that's like.
Research also supports the use of role-playing games in therapy as well. A case study was conducted that aimed to reduce delinquent behavior in adolescents, and found that the role-playing game therapy recipients had reduced delinquent behavior, higher levels of social problem solving, and they reported that they had higher satisfaction with the treatment program compared to the comparison group with normal therapy methods. While single-player RPGs may not have the socially therapeutic effects of social role-playing games, they are still beneficial for their own reasons. One is that a player can develop empathy by stepping into the shoes of someone else and by experiencing situations that don't exist in their normal day-to-day life. A male might play through a narratively focused role-playing game as a female protagonist, and that might allow them to experience vicariously their unique struggles. You can also learn the customs and traditions of other races and cultures by playing games associated with those cultures, which can lead to a patience or empathy towards people who are different from us. There are a wide variety of roles that can be experimented with in role-playing games, whether it be morally via good and evil, through identity aspects like gender or race, or through personality like patience or confidence. Experiencing these roles can allow us to have the perspective of what our lives might be like if we were someone else, and to practice or observe the skills that those characters have. It is the combination of the freedom of restriction from your looking glass self-responsibilities, the low commitment and high exploratory nature of being in an environment where you can freely float around an identity moratorium, and the fact that some skills learned and observed from role-playing games can be transferred to real life that make RPGs one of the best options for exploring who we are. I want to reference back to the quote from the beginning of the video. The only difference between the entertainment form known as the role-playing game and the role-playing game of real life is that, for some reason, a great deal of seriousness and levity is handed to each person in tandem with the role they choose or are given. Role-playing games can show us that not every role we take on needs to be taken so seriously, that not every decision we make needs to be a permanent mark on our record of identity. Role-playing games allow us to experiment and play around with who we are and who we aren't. They can help us become more social or develop empathy towards people who are different from us, to become confident in the face of adversity, to experience worlds and times outside of our wildest imaginations, to love, to lose, to rise, to fall. They allow us to reflect on the kind of person we are and the kind of person that we want to be.
Do as you must then, but we scions will fight until the heavens fall, until our last breath.
So remember, the next time you boot up Skyrim or draft a new character for D&D, you aren't just going on an adventure. You are also exploring and shaping your own identity. Don't be afraid to step into the shoes of a character that is outside of your comfort zone. You might just learn something new about yourself. Thanks for watching.